Chapter 1. First Encounter. Damian Voss stood tall, his commanding presence drawing the eyes of everyone in the room. The gala was meant to be an evening of celebration, but the moment his gaze met Soren Blake's across the ballroom, everything shifted. There was something undeniable in the way Soren looked at him, intense, calculating, and full of challenge. Their eyes locked for a fraction of a second before Soren turned away, but the magnetic pull between them was instant. Damian's heart raced, something foreign stirring deep within him. The attraction was potent, but so was the danger. As they both made their way through the crowd, their paths inevitably crossed. When their hands brushed lightly, a jolt of energy surged between them, electrifying the air. The sensation was raw, untamed, and instinctual. Neither of them was prepared for it. The room seemed to spin as their instincts flared, their alpha tendencies clashing violently. Damian's eyes narrowed, but before he could compose himself, Soren stepped closer, their bodies colliding with an almost primal force. They stood inches apart, both knowing their encounter was anything but coincidental. "I don't think we should be in the same room," Damian muttered, his voice dangerously low. Soren smirked, unfazed. "You can try to stay away, but we both know that's impossible." The tension between them only deepened, both men realizing they couldn't ignore the bond that was already forming. And yet, neither was willing to acknowledge it. The night ended in an uncomfortable silence, but neither could forget the explosive encounter. Chapter 2. Secrets Unveiled. Damian couldn't shake the lingering sensation of Soren's touch. It haunted him in every waking moment. He buried himself in his work, trying to drown out the thoughts of the gala and the intense attraction he'd felt. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't focus. Soren had wormed his way into his mind, and the more Damian tried to push him out, the stronger the pull became. Meanwhile, Soren grappled with his own demons. His past was a maze of broken promises and lies, a history that he kept hidden from everyone, even from himself. The bond with Damian wasn't just a simple attraction, it was a curse, a reminder of everything he had lost. He confided in his most trusted ally, a fellow alpha who had seen the darkest corners of his soul. "You're letting him control you," the ally warned, his voice full of concern. "You know what happens when you get tangled up with someone like him." Soren's jaw tightened. "It's too late. We've already crossed the line." As the days passed, their paths continued to cross. Each encounter was more intense than the last, their power struggles growing. Neither could escape the magnetic pull that was drawing them closer to something neither was ready for, something neither could control. Chapter 3. Tension and Temptation. The tension between Damian and Soren reached its peak as they were forced to work together on a business venture. Their competitive nature and refusal to back down led to a series of heated arguments, both in the boardroom and in private. Each encounter felt like a battle of wills, with neither willing to give an inch. Their clashing personalities made collaboration nearly impossible, but there was an undeniable chemistry simmering beneath the surface. One night, after an argument that almost escalated to violence, Damian found himself alone with Soren in an empty office. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words. Before either of them could speak, Soren moved closer, their bodies mere inches apart. The tension was unbearable. "I hate you," Damian growled, his voice barely a whisper. Soren smirked, his eyes darkening. "Prove it." What followed was a night that blurred the lines between anger and desire. Their bodies collided with a fiery passion, as though their bond was a force they couldn't fight, no matter how much they tried. The encounter left them both exhausted and confused, neither knowing how to process what had just happened. They didn't speak the next day, but the bond had only deepened. Chapter 4. The Push and Pull. The next few days were a blur of tension and avoidance. Damian was determined to regain control, to break free from the bond that was slowly consuming him. He threw himself into his work, focusing on the tasks at hand, but Soren was never far from his thoughts. Every glance, every passing moment, seemed to remind him of what he had tried so hard to ignore. Soren, too, was struggling. His pride and ambition kept him at arm's length from Damian, but his alpha instincts were in conflict with everything he believed. He had worked too hard to build his empire, and yet here he was, at the mercy of a bond he couldn't control. Their interactions grew increasingly hostile, each confrontation fueled by their stubbornness. Finally, during a high-stakes business meeting, the pressure boiled over. In a fit of rage, Damian slammed his fist on the table, his alpha dominance radiating through the room. "Stay out of my way," he snarled. Soren stood tall, unmoving. "Make me," he challenged. The room crackled with their power, but in the end, neither could deny the attraction that still simmered between them. Both walked away, but neither was truly free from the other. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The intensity of Damian and Soren's bond reached a tipping point. Their interactions were no longer just about business or rivalry. They were now deeply personal, their emotions raw and untamed. Damian, desperate to regain control, began using more manipulative tactics to push Soren away. He played on Soren's insecurities, knowing exactly which buttons to press to make him react. But Soren, ever the enigma, fought back with equal ferocity. Soren's methods were more subtle but no less dangerous. He began to withhold his attention, deliberately pulling away from Damian, making him question every word and action. It was a game of cat and mouse, and neither was willing to admit they were the prey. The more Damian pushed, the more Soren retaliated, until their carefully constructed facades began to crumble. Their final confrontation was inevitable. In a heated exchange, they both laid bare their deepest fears and desires, the words cutting through the tension like a blade. The anger between them was palpable, but so was the desire. Neither was prepared for the explosive release that followed, a night of passion that left them both shattered. When the morning came, neither could face the other. They parted without a word, but the bond between them was now an undeniable fact. There was no turning back. No matter how hard they tried, neither could escape the pull of their connection. Chapter 6. Unwilling to let go. Days passed without a word between Damian and Soren, but the silence only deepened the longing they both tried to deny. Damian was consumed with guilt, wondering if he had pushed too far, if he had broken something irreparable. He couldn't shake the image of Soren's face, the way his eyes had looked at him with a mixture of anger and desire. Soren, too, was conflicted. He had never been one to admit vulnerability, but with Damian, it felt impossible to keep his guard up. The bond between them was like a constant ache, a presence in every moment. Despite all the pain, despite the toxicity, Soren found himself thinking about Damian in ways he couldn't control. Their paths inevitably crossed again, this time in a more private setting. The tension between them was palpable, each man standing at the edge of something dangerous. Neither spoke at first, but the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Finally, Soren broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his eyes dark and conflicted. Damian's gaze hardened. "You're right. But neither of us can walk away." Chapter 7. Dangerous Desires. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, each encounter between Damian and Soren more intense than the last. Their bond, once a source of anger and frustration, now simmered with an undeniable attraction. Neither of them could resist the pull, no matter how much they tried. It was a dangerous game they were playing, one that could destroy them both. One evening, as they found themselves alone once more, the air between them crackled with tension. They were both on edge, each man struggling with the emotions the other stirred within him. The space between them was charged, and neither could look away. Damian took a step forward, his breath shallow. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Soren's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something softer behind them. "I'm not the one who keeps pushing." With that, they collided again, their bodies coming together in a frenzy of passion and frustration. The night was an explosion of emotions, raw and untamed, leaving both of them questioning everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. Chapter 8. An Unexpected Confession. The aftermath of their encounter left both men reeling. The connection between them had grown stronger, but so had the danger it posed. Damian and Soren couldn't ignore the fact that their bond was slowly consuming them, but neither was willing to back down. The following days were filled with tension as they tried to navigate their feelings. Damian, ever the strategist, tried to push Soren away, but it was clear that the more he fought it, the stronger the pull became. Soren, on the other hand, struggled with his own emotions. He had always prided himself on his control, But Damian had a way of breaking through his defenses in ways no one else ever had. One night, after a particularly heated argument, they found themselves alone again, the air thick with unspoken words. Damian was the first to speak, his voice low and raw. "I've never felt like this before," he admitted, his gaze searching Soren's face. "You're destroying me." Soren's response was unexpected. "I feel the same way. But I can't stop." It was a confession that neither of them was ready for, but it was the truth, and it set the stage for what was to come. Chapter 9. Testing Boundaries. Damian and Soren continued to test the boundaries of their relationship, pushing each other to the edge with every encounter. Their bond, once a source of power struggles and resentment, was now a dangerous, intoxicating force that neither could escape. Each time they were together, the lines between love and hate blurred further, and neither knew how to stop it. Their confrontations became more frequent, as did the moments of unexpected intimacy. Every time they tried to distance themselves, they were drawn back together, unable to resist the magnetic pull that had grown between them. It was a cycle they couldn't break, no matter how hard they tried. Damian found himself losing control more and more, his emotions running wild. He had never been one to show vulnerability, but with Soren, it felt impossible to keep up the facade. Soren, too, was struggling with his own demons. The bond between them was like a drug, and neither could quit it. One night, during a particularly intense confrontation, they pushed each other too far. Words were said that couldn't be taken back, and actions followed that changed everything between them. But in the end, they were still tied together by the bond they couldn't escape. Chapter 10. Power Struggles. Damian and Soren's relationship was evolving into something neither of them was prepared for. Their constant push and pull were beginning to take a toll on both men, but neither could break free. The power struggles between them intensified, each trying to maintain control while being pulled deeper into the chaos they created. It was a battle, not just for dominance, but for emotional survival. Soren's patience was wearing thin. Every move Damian made felt like a calculated attempt to manipulate him, to make him feel inferior. But Soren wasn't one to back down. He started fighting fire with fire, matching Damian's every move with his own brand of rebellion. Their interactions grew more volatile, each encounter leaving them both bruised, both emotionally and physically. One evening, after a particularly explosive argument, Damian found himself alone in his thoughts. He realized something that terrified him. He cared for Soren more than he had ever allowed himself to admit. The realization was both a blessing and a curse. He couldn't let go, but he also couldn't hold on. Soren, too, was grappling with his own feelings. He had always prided himself on being unshakable, but Damian had become an irresistible force. It scared him how deeply he felt for someone who had caused him so much pain. But still, he couldn't stop himself from wanting more, from needing more. Chapter 11. A Thin Line. The fine line between love and hate was something Damian and Soren walked every day, and neither knew how much longer they could keep their balance. They were both in too deep, their emotions tangled in ways neither could unravel. The attraction between them was undeniable, but it was also destructive. Every conversation was laced with tension, every touch a reminder of the storm that brewed beneath the surface. Damian tried to distance himself, but Soren was always there, just out of reach, teasing him, challenging him. It was maddening. He was caught between the desire to be close and the fear of what that closeness would bring. Soren's feelings were no less complicated. He had always believed in control, in maintaining distance from those who threatened to make him vulnerable. But with Damian, it felt impossible. Damian had a way of breaking down his walls, and Soren couldn't decide whether he wanted to build them back up or let them crumble. The emotional and physical distance between them grew even more intense, but so did the attraction. Their moments together became charged with unspoken words and desires that neither of them could fully acknowledge. The line between them was growing thinner by the day, and neither was ready to cross it, until one night they did. Chapter 12. The Breaking Point. Damian and Soren had reached a breaking point. The emotional turmoil that had been building for weeks finally exploded one evening when they found themselves in each other's presence, unable to avoid the inevitable. Their words were sharp, biting, full of everything they had tried to keep buried. The tension reached its peak, and in a moment of pure frustration, they collided. The passion between them was explosive, but it wasn't tender. It was full of anger, regret, and desire. Each kiss, each touch, felt like both a punishment and a release. They didn't know how to stop, even though they knew they should. Everything about their relationship was toxic, yet they couldn't break free from it. When the storm finally passed, they lay in silence, both exhausted and emotionally drained. The night had changed them. They knew they couldn't go back to the way things had been, but they also couldn't deny the pull that kept bringing them together. It was a dangerous game they were playing, but neither was willing to stop. Soren, ever the strategist, was the first to speak. "This can't go on," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Damian, his eyes closed, sighed deeply. "I know. But it already has." Chapter 13. Aftermath. The aftermath of their encounter left both men reeling. They tried to pretend nothing had changed, but it was impossible. Every time their paths crossed, the air between them was thick with tension. They were both on edge, neither knowing how to proceed. Damian couldn't shake the image of Soren, the way he had looked in the heat of their argument, the way his body had responded to every touch. It was a reminder that beneath the anger and frustration, there was something much deeper, something they both feared. But neither could bring themselves to acknowledge it, not yet. Soren, too, was struggling with the aftermath. He was used to being in control, but Damian had managed to destabilize him in ways no one ever had. It wasn't just the physicality of their encounter, it was the emotional intensity that had followed. He couldn't stop thinking about it, about how it felt to be vulnerable with someone who had always been his rival. They avoided each other for a few days, but the silence only made the tension worse. The unresolved feelings, the burning attraction, were still there, lurking beneath the surface. Neither of them could ignore it, but neither knew how to face it. They were trapped in their own cycle, unable to break free. Chapter 14. The Price of Desire. Damian and Soren's desire for each other had become a double-edged sword. They couldn't resist the pull, but every time they gave in, the consequences were worse than before. The toxic nature of their relationship had taken a toll, not just on them, but on everyone around them. Their personal and professional lives were both in turmoil. Damian's mind was a mess. He couldn't focus on work, couldn't concentrate on anything other than Soren. Every moment spent with him felt like both a victory and a defeat. He was losing control, and the more he tried to push Soren away, the closer they seemed to get. It was maddening. Soren, too, felt the weight of their bond. He had always prided himself on being the master of his emotions, but with Damian, he was losing himself. The desire that had once felt so wrong now seemed to consume him, and he couldn't figure out if it was love, hate, or something in between. One night, after yet another explosive argument, they found themselves alone together, their bodies once again drawn to each other despite their better judgment. The consequences of their desire were clear, but neither could stop themselves. It was too late for both of them to turn back. Chapter 15. Crossed Lines. The lines between Damian and Soren had long since been crossed, and neither knew how to untangle the mess they had made. Their encounters had grown more unpredictable, their emotions more volatile. They were no longer just rivals or enemies. They were something far more dangerous. Every time they came together, it felt like a battle, and neither was willing to surrender. Soren had begun to question everything: his feelings, his motivations, and his desire for Damian. He knew that what they had was toxic, that it was unsustainable. But at the same time, he couldn't bring himself to let go. There was something about Damian that kept drawing him back, something he couldn't understand, no matter how hard he tried. Damian was no better off. He was consumed by his need for Soren, but he was also terrified of the power Soren had over him. He hated how vulnerable Soren made him feel, how he seemed to see through all his defenses. But at the same time, he couldn't resist the connection between them, no matter how destructive it was. Their interactions became even more intense, their fights more brutal. It was clear that neither was willing to back down, but at the same time, neither could find the strength to walk away. They were locked in a cycle of love and hate, unable to break free, and neither knew what would happen when they reached the end. Chapter 16. The Deepening. Damian and Soren were no longer just enemies or lovers. They had become something much more complicated. The intensity between them had grown so deep that even their moments of silence were charged with unspoken words. They could no longer pretend that nothing was happening between them, that the force pulling them together was just temporary. Every interaction felt like a game of chicken, with each waiting for the other to break first. Damian found himself growing increasingly frustrated, but also increasingly drawn to Soren. He had never felt so conflicted in his life, so torn between wanting to dominate and wanting to surrender. Soren, on the other hand, had always believed in control, but with Damian, he was losing his grip. They found themselves constantly circling each other, never quite touching but always feeling the heat of their presence. Even the smallest interaction seemed to have massive consequences. A simple look could set off a chain reaction, leading them to places they didn't want to go but couldn't avoid. The pull between them was becoming impossible to ignore, and neither was willing to admit that they needed each other. One evening, as they faced each other in a standoff, their eyes locked, and for the first time, neither of them knew what to say. The tension in the room was unbearable, and in that moment, it became clear that the game they had been playing was no longer just about power. It was about survival, emotional survival. Chapter 17. Breaking the Ice. Soren had never been one for vulnerability, yet with Damian, he found himself slipping. It was becoming harder to keep up the walls he had so carefully built. The more they fought, the more their defenses crumbled, and what was left behind wasn't just anger or hatred, it was raw emotion. The night after their last confrontation, Soren decided to take a step he never thought he'd take. He reached out. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a simple message, but it was a crack in the armor. Damian, always the first to retaliate, was silent at first. But the silence between them wasn't the same this time. It was pregnant with something else. Something new, something frightening. Damian had never been good at admitting when he was wrong, but with Soren, he found it impossible to ignore the weight of his own actions. He had hurt Soren in ways he hadn't fully realized. For the first time, he understood that their power struggles had consequences that went beyond what either of them was willing to admit. Still, he couldn't stop the pattern. They were too deep in it now. As the days passed, they began to shift, even if it was only slightly. They were no longer just fighting. They were learning. Learning about each other, learning about themselves. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't smooth, but it was progress. And for the first time in a long while, Damian wasn't sure if he wanted to push Soren away anymore. Chapter 18. The Shift. Damian and Soren had been at odds for so long that it was hard to remember what it felt like to be anything but enemies. But something had changed between them. The walls they had built around their hearts were starting to come down, and the sparks that had once been fueled by animosity were now filled with something else, something far more complicated. They found themselves engaging in conversations that were less about control and more about understanding. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The physical tension between them was still there, but it wasn't as destructive as before. Now, when their hands brushed or their gazes locked, it felt less like a war and more like an invitation. But there was still a long way to go. Soren had learned to let his guard down, but not fully. He was still terrified of what would happen if he gave in completely. Damian, too, was struggling with his own fears. He was no longer sure of his motives, no longer sure if what he felt for Soren was love or something far darker. The uncertainty hung in the air, thick and heavy, but neither was willing to back away. In the quiet moments between them, when neither spoke, the weight of their shared history pressed down on them. But there was something else now, something new. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make it work. Even if that meant fighting through every obstacle together. Chapter 19. Confronting the Past. For all their progress, Damian and Soren had yet to confront the most important thing between them, their pasts. Every fight, every kiss, every word was shaped by the experiences they hadn't shared with each other. Neither had been truly open about the reasons they were the way they were. And until they did, they both knew that their bond would remain fragile. Soren's past was a maze of betrayals and pain, and it had shaped him into the guarded, calculating person he was today. He had learned early on that trust was a liability, that letting anyone close meant inviting disaster. Damian, too, had his demons, though they were different. His need for control came from a place of insecurity, from a fear of losing everything he had worked for. One evening, after a particularly intense argument, They found themselves in the midst of an unexpected confrontation. Words were exchanged that neither of them had planned to say. The rawness of the moment shocked them both. Soren revealed the scars that had been hidden for so long, and Damian admitted to fears he had never allowed himself to voice. It was painful, but it was necessary. For the first time, they saw each other for who they truly were, not just rivals or lovers, but two broken people trying to make sense of the wreckage they had created. The truth hurt, but it was also freeing. They couldn't move forward without it. And in that moment, they both realized that the only way to survive this was to confront the past head-on, together. Chapter 20. Uncharted Territory. Now that they had confronted their pasts, Damian and Soren found themselves in uncharted territory. The foundation of their relationship had shifted once again, and they were left standing in the ruins, unsure of what to do next. They had shared their vulnerabilities, but they were still unsure if they could rebuild what had been broken. The tension was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer about power or control. It was about something deeper, something scarier. They were no longer just playing games. They were both invested in the outcome, whether they were ready to admit it or not. Soren's walls had come down, but the damage had been done. He was still afraid to open up completely, afraid of what would happen if he did. Damian, too, had been broken by the truth, but in a different way. The realization that he wasn't as in control as he had once believed terrified him, but it also freed him. For the first time, he was able to let go of the need to dominate, if only a little. The journey ahead was uncertain. They knew that they couldn't go back to the way things had been, but they also knew that they couldn't keep fighting forever. They had to find a new way forward. Together. But the question remained, could they? Or were they too far gone? Chapter 21. The First Step Forward. As time passed, the friction between Damian and Soren began to take on a different shape. They were no longer consumed by rage, but there was still a constant undercurrent of tension between them. Each time they interacted, it felt like they were standing on the edge of something dangerous, but also thrilling. It was a silent agreement that formed between them. They would try to rebuild, try to understand, try to be something more than just enemies or reluctant lovers. But the road was never going to be easy. Every conversation felt like a battle, every touch was laced with hesitation, but both of them knew that they couldn't walk away now. Not when they had come so far. One night, after a tense meeting, Damian did something unexpected. He reached out to Soren in a way that was vulnerable. It wasn't much, just a small gesture, but it was enough to break the invisible wall between them for a brief moment. Soren didn't pull away, but he didn't embrace it either. Instead, he stayed there, caught between his instincts and his growing feelings. They both realized that it wasn't about perfection. It was about taking that first step forward, even when they didn't know where it would lead. They were learning to trust again, not with words, but with actions. It was slow, but it was real. And that was enough for now. Chapter 22. The Struggle for Control. Control had always been Damian's weapon, and he had wielded it expertly in every aspect of his life. But with Soren, it was different. Soren didn't follow the same rules, didn't bend the same way. He was a force of nature that couldn't be tamed, and that terrified Damian more than he cared to admit. Soren, for his part, was tired of the endless games. He was tired of constantly battling for control in a relationship that was meant to be something more. He knew the power dynamics between them had to change if they were going to have any hope of moving forward. But change was hard. The pull of old habits was strong, and every time he felt like they were making progress, it seemed like they took 2 steps back. It was during one of their increasingly frequent arguments that they both realized the truth. They were trying to control each other instead of learning to coexist. Soren wanted freedom, and Damian wanted security. They both needed to let go, just a little, and that was the hardest part. Neither of them had ever been willing to compromise before, but now it seemed like their only option. That night, as the tension finally broke, they made an unspoken vow to change. It wouldn't happen overnight, but they both knew that if they kept trying to control each other, they would lose whatever it was they were building. The struggle for control wasn't just about power, it was about finding balance. And that, more than anything, was what they both needed. Chapter 23. Unveiling the Truth. As their relationship progressed, Damian and Soren found themselves facing truths they had been avoiding. The more they opened up to each other, the more they realized how much they had been hiding, not just from each other, but from themselves. They had both built lives based on lies, lies they were now starting to unravel. Soren, ever the strategist, had kept his feelings and his past under lock and key for so long that even he had forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable. But with Damian, it was different. The walls that had once felt like a fortress now felt like a prison. And as the days went by, he began to see how much he had been hurting himself by keeping everything locked away. Damian, too, was confronting his demons. The facade of control he had so carefully cultivated was crumbling, and with it, his understanding of who he really was. His need to dominate had always been a defense mechanism, but now, with Soren, he was starting to see that he didn't need to control everything to be strong. He needed to be honest with himself. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. They couldn't continue pretending that they were something they weren't. They had to face what lay beneath the surface. And in doing so, they discovered something powerful: the possibility of real connection. Chapter 24. Breaking Free. For the first time, Damian and Soren found themselves standing on equal ground. The balance between them had shifted in a way neither of them expected, but it was exactly what they needed. The constant push and pull had taken its toll, and now they were beginning to let go of the need to fight. The change didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, like the slow unfurling of a flower. They had learned to respect each other's boundaries, to allow space where there was once only tension. And yet, even with this newfound respect, the passion between them still simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to ignite. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. For the first time, they were able to let go of their pasts, if only for a moment, and truly experience each other. The weight of their previous struggles no longer felt like an anchor. Instead, it felt like a lesson, a necessary chapter in the story they were now writing together. And as they stood there, side by side, they knew that this was only the beginning. They had broken free of the chains that had once bound them, both to each other and to their pasts. What came next was unknown, but they were no longer afraid to face it. Chapter 25. A New Beginning. The journey Damian and Soren had taken was far from over, but they had reached a turning point. The tension that had once defined their every interaction was now a distant memory, replaced by something quieter, something more enduring. They were no longer bound by the games of power or control. They were free to be who they were, together. As they stood together in the quiet of the night, they shared a moment of clarity. The road ahead would have its challenges, but they no longer feared it. They had learned that love wasn't about domination or submission. It was about understanding and compromise. It was about growing together, even when it was hard. Damian reached for Soren's hand, the contact simple but meaningful. For the first time, it wasn't a challenge or a test. It was just two people, standing together, ready to face whatever came next. And with that, they stepped into the unknown, no longer as enemies or reluctant lovers, but as partners. Their future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were no longer afraid of what it might hold.